Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The government is reviving the National Service Training Program, or Program Latihan Khidmat Negara, 5 years after it was scrapped by the 2018 Pakatan Harapan administration. Now, Defence Minister Muhammad Hassan announced that it will be a different training scheme from previous iterations. It will involve some 20,000 youth training at existing military camps for 45 days. Now, is there merit in resurrecting the National Service Program? And if so, how should it be reimagined for today's generation? Later in the show, we will be joined by former Minister of Youth and Sports Saddiq, Syed, Abdul Rahman. But my first guest tonight is Jason Wee, who is the co-founder of Architects of Diversity, which is a non-profit working to bridge communities and identity groups among youth. Jason, thank you for joining me this evening. Architects of Diversity has put out on social media that it is of the position that the National Service Program has the potential to rebuild social bridges in a way that isn't replicable by other programs or other interventions. I want to start there, Jason. What is it in national service that you see potential for developing meaningful ties?
Thanks, Melissa. That's a great question. And I think a lot of negative perceptions surround PLKN because of the various issues around its corruption and various cases of abuse. But I think at its core, PLKN, we need to identify, is one of the most important tools in countering extremism and building bridges between different races and religion. And I think the answer to this is we need to put it in context that the country is getting more segregated. Yes, we need to solve for the segregation, but in the meantime, we have a generation of youth divided, and that must be addressed, right? When we think about GE15 and the TikTok videos about May 13, these are youth exposed to echo chambers on social media that are not meeting individuals of different backgrounds who are growing up in homogenous areas and schools, never being able to meet and befriend people of different backgrounds on a transformative level. And I say transformative here because I think that's what sets out PLKN compared to other programs. Perhaps you're going to a workshop where you meet an individual maybe for a day or a weekend. But I think the biggest and most potent part about PLKN is its residential nature, where you're living with the person, you're with them with a longer period of time, where you see them pray, you see them meet their cultural needs. And these are very important steps to understanding how youth of different backgrounds are able to relate and create empathy for each other. And I know the elements, from drawing all the way from how many friends you have from a different race or background, all the way to the kind of political polarization we're seeing, it is a long string, but it's a string that is quite important to address. And there are currently no other programs in Malaysia so far that are targeting youth at a very deep level to the extent that PLKN would.
All right. But you, I'm sure, are aware of the long-standing criticisms around the National Service Program, the reason why it was abolished in the first place. What would Architects of Diversity recommend if you were to reimagine it or strengthen this latest iteration of PLKN?
That's great. And I think this is actually quite a scientific question, right? When we put youth of different background in the same room, you can't just chuck them in there and expect all of them to be friends. There are certain elements of which that needs to be practiced in order for good intergroup dynamics to exist. So for instance, even just reducing the camp size can do wonders, as well as balancing ratios between ethnic groups, right? Where there's not necessarily the group that constitutes the majority, and therefore creates healthier dynamics in terms of race. But I think more administratively, what we're seeing here, and I could go into details, but I think at the stage of PLKN discussion where we're at, where the PLKN Council hasn't even been established, we need to talk about what elements or what parts need to be there to ensure that PLKN, number one, is focused on social cohesion, right? I think there is a large militaristic approach at it now. While that can flatten a lot of identities, I think what PLKN could possibly do is promote difference and unique differences across different groups. The second thing is really administratively, how do we ensure that who is designing the program is in touch with the Gen Z mindset, right? I think, if anything, my generation at this point is quite done with sitting in lectures or even taking as marching as a very productive activity. And there's a lot of skepticism and there's a lot of, I think, dismay with potentially going to a 45-day program and doing all these things. So how do we ensure that people are in the correct place to have that voice within the design of PLKN? And so as we are in this juncture of talking about it coming alive, we need to, number one, ensure that youth representation is present on the PLKN Council. But number two, that there is a nonpartisan representation and constituency of who makes up this PLKN Council. There's also been a lot of allegations of, brainwashing of political propaganda within PLKN. And that's extremely regrettable, right? And I don't think anyone will defend the versions of PLKN that have those elements. However, I think a true PLKN would teach about intercultural dynamics. I would talk about nonviolent communication as a means to resolve conflict and approach closer to peace education.
Well, what you're saying, I'm sure, resonates with a lot of people, but the Deputy Prime Minister, Fadila Yusuf, has already said that the revived PLKN is going to be 90% military-style training, 10% civics studies. I'm wondering whether this decision to revive the national service reflects maybe an older generation's perception that discipline and patriotism and quote-unquote quality can be instilled in today's Gen Z youth through a 45-day military-style boot camp approach, and whether we are not focusing on the social cohesion part, which is the stated aim of this national service program. How do we ensure that it doesn't turn into a boot camp and in fact achieves its stated objectives?
Well, I think just to preface that is that I think we're currently still at a very much early stage in discussing PLKN, where it was just brought up in Parliament on Monday, and I would suspect that it's still very much open to input. And so I hope, at least on my end, that the administration surrounding PLKN can have both a balance of the militaristic nature of it, because I think that's a fair and need in terms of the government, right? Ensuring that its citizens are aware and capable to possibly act into reserve forces. But at the same time, even for myself, the 90 to 10% ratio, it is quite disproportionate, right? And when we're thinking about civilians, we're thinking about youth, particularly the COVID generation who are not exposed to that. We also need to possibly maximize these 45 days to ensure social cohesion, which is one of the few things that can be accomplished through conscription methods, right? And that is not to say where follow-up activities after PLKN, since that might potentially be a thing for recruits who are interested to pursue more defense-natured participation that can happen. And so I think, just to answer your question, Melissa, my hope is that government is open to input at this point, and individuals are not shutting down PLKN wholesale. I think there's a huge appetite for it, and more especially, there's a huge need of it. Rather than shutting it out wholesale, how do we ensure that different considerations can be made on the drawing board at this time?
Right. Jason, I'm glad that I'm speaking to you because Architects of Diversity has unique experience in this with Scholar Diversity. So what would you like to see, having that experience, be incorporated into this or be taken into consideration, since we are hopefully still at the drawing board at this point in time?
Right. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, that's great. Number one, I think, and more importantly, there needs to be a diversity of trainers. In previous studies, one of the main flaws of PLKN was that a lot of the trainers were monoethnic or majority Malay. And this means that the environment wasn't necessarily safe for minority groups within these camps. In Scholar Diversity, in our programs, for example, one of the few things that we make sure we do is ensure that diversity is represented at the trainer level, and ensuring that groups of different backgrounds can come to the camp and feel safe. And I want to highlight feeling safe here, because that's one of the prerequisites to ensuring that contact is healthy and can produce good dynamics within a camp. The second thing, and even before we go into the specific activities, it's having independent monitoring and evaluation. That's something that we do quite strictly within Architects of Diversity, that every time we finish a program, before we move on to the next one, we're evaluating what works and what doesn't. In terms of PLKN, they need to bring in independent reviewers and scholars who are, I think, more than hungry to be able to evaluate it in multiple aspects. The third thing I would say is, how do we build community? Because that's one of the, again, the unique propositions of PLKN. And for that, I think it needs to combine both programmatic aspects of how do you build agreements with each other? How do you reach consensus? How do you converse about really taboo topics in the country? And this might be an overstretch for PLKN, but some level of introduction into the topic itself and being able to provide the tools to youth to be able to engage these topics using a civil manner. And I think the last thing I kind of want to mention in terms of reforms is really an ombudsman, where we need some form of system to prevent cases of abuse, sexual harassment, and racism from happening within these camps. Yes, it is preventative, but that also sets a tone for what kinds of norms and behaviors are tolerated within a camp. If we can properly model that behavior, then sure, 45 days might be short, but that is a good and possible effective intervention to how we model relationships outside of PLKN.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Jason Wee from Architects of Diversity. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. We're discussing the revival of the National Service Training Program, or PLKM as its Malay acronym is better known by its Malay acronym. Joining me now is Syed Saddiq, Syed Abdul Rahman. He's the MP for Muar and President of MUDA. He's also the former Minister of Youth and Sports. Saddiq, when you abolished PLKN in 2018, you cited reasons such as it being a waste of money, it was ethnocentric, to quote you, and you said it was being used as a political tool. Now that we hear the program is going to be brought back, do you believe that those concerns still apply today?
I mean, to be honest, it wasn't my decision only. In 2018, in Pakatan Harapan's manifesto, it was clearly outlined that PLKN and BTN will be abolished. And it was the coalition's decision, which was then discussed in cabinet and collectively agreed and decided. And I was merely the person who fulfilled PH demands as it was part and parcel of the manifesto. And let us not forget that PLKN previously was under the Defense Ministry, and BTN was under the Prime Minister's office. But when it was transferred to the Youth and Sports Ministry, the budget was zeroized. I just want to give context. The total budget of the Sports Ministry, Youth and Sports, governing youth programs and total sports for athletes, Paralympics, para-athletes, training, Olympics, Asian Games, SEA Games, in total, the budget, including the payment of thousands of staff, is only about R1 billion a year. PLKN took up about 700 million ringgit a year. So can you imagine, when PLKN was transferred from the Defense Ministry to the Youth and Sports Ministry with R0 Malaysia, how do you expect that as a new minister that I'm supposed to slash what, 2/3 of the cost of my ministry then for PLKN? Obviously, it became truly unfeasible, and the Minister of Finance was unwilling to allocate additional allocations for PLKN in this regards. However, I also want to share something, because I hope the government knows what it's walking into. And truly, I'm also bizarre being in opposition, because this is something which was promised by PH in 2018. The abolishment of PLKN, the abolishment of BTN, the abolishment of JASA and JCOM. But now when they are in power, they have actually actively revived, defended, and give additional allocations. Back then it was JASA, today JCOM, the indoctrination propaganda unit of government. Back then they said they want to abolish PLKN, now they want to revive PLKN. Back then they said we should abolish BTN, now they want to revive BTN. So I find it truly bizarre. Is it only for elections, or they condemn BN, or BN cannot do it, but when they are in power, we can do it? And I hope the
Okay.
public hold them accountable for this. So that's one. But I want to put politics aside, right? I mean, forget, let's say that, these are just election promises and it's unimportant. Let's put that aside. The next question, which I think the public deserves to ask, and we need to answer, where will the money come from? I mean, we are hearing the government, especially from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Economy, that we all have to go through belt tightening measures, that subsidies will be cut, right? I mean, petrol subsidy will be cut, electricity subsidy will be cut, cash handouts will be cut. I mean, Malaysians will all feel the impact of these cuts. Cost of living will increase. Look at control items like rice, sugar, packet oil, which are now not in the market, which leads to increasing cost of living. So everyone must take that cut. However, suddenly, now we hear of the revival of PLKN. I just want to give a little bit of number and context. We have spent, collectively, taxpayers, your money, you have spent 8 billion ringgit to finance PLKN previously. 8 billion ringgit. And to put that into context, per trainee, taxpayers will need to subsidize close to 10,000 ringgit per person. 8 billion ringgit, total taxpayers' money to finance PLKN previously. 8,000 ringgit per trainee for a 1 to 3 months course. PLKN in Malaysia is not the same like Singapore and South Korea, where it will last for about 1 year and 2 years. PLKN in Malaysia is a lot more of like a summer camp. So I just want to share these numbers because the government will have to answer.
Okay, so what would you then posit as the reason for bringing this back? I mean, despite its long and troubled history, who benefits from bringing PLKN back? Is there political capital to be gained? What do you understand to be the reason behind it?
To be honest, it's still preliminary in nature because it was answered by the Minister of Defence. And the Minister of Defence committed that it will not cost as much as before, and we have to give him a little bit of flexibility. However, again, I take great caution because previously, under BN's era, they promised that PLKN will not cost more than 200 million. Then it ballooned to 400 million. Then they said they will cap the price at 500 million per year. Then it ballooned to 750 million a year of taxpayers' money. I mean, all the promises were taken out. And I remember then, it was the leaders, ministers of today in PH, who were campaigning against PLKN.
So we heard from Jason Wee, Architects of Diversity, a bit earlier, who thinks that there's something in the National Service Program that can help bridge social divides, bring together social cohesion, address rising ethno-religious radicalism. Do you think there are aspects of this program that can be salvaged, that can be improved upon, that can be reimagined to address some of these issues?
Okay, I want to make it very clear. I'm not against boot camps or training centers or summer camps if it could foster unity and if the pricing could truly be controlled, because I'm very, very sensitive when it comes to government's expenditure, especially in a time in which government will cut back on subsidies, which will really impact the middle class, the average Malaysian, whether you are living in Damansara or whether you are living in Muar or Baling. I mean, whether you are urban, poor, middle class, you will be affected. So I'm very, very careful and sensitive on expenditure. However, I also acknowledge that there's a need to foster unity, multiracialism, moderation, and instill patriotic values. So my suggestion is threefold. Number one, if it could be optional, make it optional. That's one. Number two, there must truly be a price cap. We cannot afford to spend 8 billion ringgit like we did before. And it wasn't me. The current Minister of Defence has gone on record, as reported by Tina, saying that the previous PLKNs have failed. I did not say it. He has said it, an acknowledgement by a BN minister when it was a BN-led program before, that the previous versions have failed. So obviously, I think there must be a price cap. Every single cent must truly be audited and controlled. And the new program must go through, this is the third element, must go through the select committee and intense debates in Parliament with great scrutiny, so that every single cent is well spent, and the programs can be run well. If it is done that way, I believe that there could be great value out of the program. I want to share. Previously, when we took out BTN and PLKN, and government saved hundreds of millions a year, then government decided to focus on schools. That means 15-year-olds and above, instead of forcing those who exit those who exit high school who are just about to enter university to go through it. So instead of focusing to that group who may need to work, who may need to get into internships, or who want to pursue their passion, we focus on high school students. Then we introduced the Malaysian Future Leadership School, which is optional, very competitive. Schools will decide, so it becomes a competition so that they join the program, and it is a 3-tiered system, and it only costs 50 million ringgit a year. So can you imagine, from 750 million, it became 50 million, and instead of subcontracting the contracts out, we allowed civil servants to run it, and at the same time, we use our existing BTN camps, which are underutilized. We have 22 BTN camps, which are well maintained. We just need to upgrade it a little bit, which are underutilized. So actually, government already have all these centers. Why are we subcontracting? We can use it and run it internally. And that was run. And I believe as ministers have changed, not just me, I introduced it, but now we have 4 or 5 different ministers of youth and sports, all have kept this program knowing that's good, because I didn't come up with it. I did it via a bipartisan fashion, like how I did Undi 18. I invited all the state ministers, Exco Belia Sukan, regardless whether they are from PAS or UMNO, to come on board, to fashion a program and then execute it together. And they can check the camps any day. That means literally the Exco Belia Sukan from UMNO, let's say in Pahang, can go into the camp and observe it on their own. And the model is presented and tabled via a bipartisan committee. So let's say they want to change the name, I don't mind. I mean, the name belongs to the government of the day. But I think we need to be very careful on the pricing, on the curriculum, so that in the end, we don't overburden taxpayers. At the same time, we get the impact-oriented assessment which we need.
Okay. So I understand your concerns. You don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Do we know if this is a done deal, if it's being still considered, still conceptualized? And what would be your red flags? What would you push back against, speak out against when this program is still being formulated?
The Minister of Defence, as reported by SINA, has said that previous versions of PLKN are simply not up to par, have not reached its intended purpose. So if you are merely replicating the same old model, there's a huge red flag. And again, I think the public should ask that question. Are we willing to spend another 8 billion ringgit, crucial money which could be used to give scholarships to the underprivileged, to build new schools, to repair toilets, as the Prime Minister would often say, to build more clinics, hospitals, absorb contract doctors? You know, these are all basic key issues which today we don't have money. Are we willing to spend 8 billion ringgit? Are we willing to spend an average of 10,000 ringgit per trainee? These are all fundamental questions which we need to ask. My job, as and when it is stable, is to go through the details, because often the devil is in the details. I know when previous governments and prime ministers conceptualized BTN and PLKN, they had the right motive and intentions in mind. However, in the end, it's always about the execution. Again, previous ministers have said they kept the price of PLKN 200 million, 300 million, 500 million a year, and then it ballooned to 700 million a year. So again, in the end, it's always about execution. So my hope, and I know Tok Mak Hassan, I mean, the Minister of Defence, I think, is a good guy. I've personally listened to his answers in Parliament. He's a former corporate. So bipartisanship is the best way forward. Present it to the Select Committee. The Select Committee will then give suggestions, invite opposition members to also scrutinize, and the scrutiny should not end when the program is conceptualized. Scrutiny should continue after the program is conceptualized. I remember when we did, or KBS came out with MFLS, the scrutiny continued after. That opposition MPs could come in, state EXCO members could come in. They can witness so that they know that this is not a PH indoctrination machine, because I'm very careful about that. So I think there is a way forward, but at the same time, we have to be very careful and scrutinized in and out when it comes to taxpayers' money.
Thank you, Saddiq, for your insights. That was Syed Saddiq, Syed Abdul Rahman, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.